Officer James Sullivan adjusted his police badge in the rearview mirror of his patrol car, his weathered face reflecting years of service in the Oakwood Police Department. At 47, he had earned a reputation, though not the kind that brought pride to the force. His personnel file was thick with civilian complaints, most of them from minorities who had encountered him during his shifts. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of Maple Grove, the city's most prestigious neighborhood. Sullivan had always felt a certain resentment patrolling these streets, where million-dollar homes stood as monuments to wealth and privilege. The residents here expected special treatment, and the department always seemed eager to provide it. His radio crackled to life. Dispatch to Unit 247, we've received reports of possible trespassing at 1542 Maple Grove Road, the Henderson residence. Neighbors report seeing teenagers on the property. Sullivan's jaw tightened. The Hendersons were away in Europe for the summer, and their sprawling Victorian mansion had been empty for weeks. Copy that, dispatch, Unit 247 responding. As he drove toward the address, Sullivan recalled the department meeting from earlier that week. Mayor Katherine Johnson, the city's first black female mayor, had announced another round of police reform initiatives. He had sat in the back of the room, arms crossed, as she spoke about implicit bias training and community policing. In his mind, it was just more political correctness getting in the way of real police work. The Henderson property came into view, its wrought iron gates standing open. Sullivan parked his cruiser at an angle across the driveway and stepped out, his hand instinctively resting on his holster. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, creating deep shadows around the property. Walking the perimeter, Sullivan noticed fresh footprints in the newly mulched flower beds. His pulse quickened. He had caught plenty of young troublemakers in this neighborhood before. The wealthy residents might complain about his methods, but they never complained about results. His radio buzzed again. Unit 247, be advised. Mrs. Henderson has confirmed no one should be on the property. Copy that, Sullivan responded, unholstering his weapon. Department protocol called for waiting for backup in potential burglary situations, but Sullivan had always preferred handling things his way. The sound of footsteps on gravel drew his attention to the side path. Years of ingrained prejudices and assumptions clouded his judgment as he moved toward the sound, weapon at the ready. In his mind, he was already writing the report. Unauthorized entry, resisting arrest, the usual story. What Sullivan didn't know, as he rounded the corner with his finger near the trigger, was that his next actions would shatter multiple lives and shake the city to its core. He didn't know that security cameras recently installed by the Hendersons were recording his every move. He didn't know that his long history of racial bias was about to intersect with a tragedy that would make national headlines. Most importantly, he didn't know that the figure he was about to encounter was someone whose presence in this neighborhood was not just legitimate, but deeply rooted in the community's history. The daughter of a woman who had fought her way to the mayor's office, who had grown up playing in these very gardens when the previous owners, her godparents, had lived here. The warm evening air carried the sweet scent of blooming jasmine, a stark contrast to the tension building in Sullivan's movements. Behind him, the sound of another patrol car approaching echoed in the distance, backup he hadn't requested and didn't want. His superior officer had been monitoring the radio traffic and recognized the address as sensitive. Any call in Maple Grove required careful handling. But it was too late. Sullivan was already committed to his course of action, his prejudices and past experiences forming a lens through which he would fatally misinterpret the next few moments. As he moved deeper into the property's shadows, the weight of his badge felt heavy against his chest, a symbol of authority he had too often wielded as a weapon rather than a shield. The stage was set for a confrontation that would expose the deep-rooted problems within the department and force the city to confront uncomfortable truths about power, privilege, and the devastating consequences of unchecked bias in law enforcement. Unknown to Officer Sullivan, his next few steps would lead him toward an encounter that would change everything, not just for him, but for an entire community poised on the brink of transformation. Maya Johnson walked along the familiar stone path she had traveled hundreds of times before, her backpack slung casually over one shoulder. The 16-year-old honor student had just finished her advanced placement study group at the local library and was taking her usual shortcut through the Henderson property to reach her friend Emma's house. The setting sun painted her dark skin in warm golden tones as she moved confidently through the garden. Her mother, Mayor Katherine Johnson, had always taught her to carry herself with dignity and pride, regardless of the looks she sometimes got in this predominantly white neighborhood. Maya had grown up here, playing in these gardens when old Mrs. Henderson, her godmother, still lived in the house. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a text from Emma. "Where are you? Movie night starts in 15. Maya smiled, typing back quickly, taking the shortcut through the Hendersons. "Be there soon." She didn't mention that Mrs. Henderson had given her permanent permission to use this path years ago, even after moving to Europe. It was just a normal part of her routine. The evening air was heavy with the scent of jasmine, bringing back memories of childhood tea parties in the garden with Mrs. Henderson. Maya had been devastated when the elderly woman decided to move abroad, but she had promised to keep an eye on the property whenever she passed through. It was their special agreement. As she walked, Maya mentally reviewed her plans for the upcoming student council meeting. As president, she had been working on a proposal to increase diversity in advanced placement classes. Her mother had always encouraged her to fight for positive change, just as she did in her role as mayor. Maya's hand brushed against the acceptance letter in her backpack. She hadn't shown it to anyone yet, not even her parents. Stanford University's early admission program had said yes. She was planning to reveal it at dinner tomorrow, imagining how proud her mother would be. Mayor Johnson had always stressed the importance of education as a path to change. The crunch of gravel under her feet echoed in the quiet evening air. Maya noticed fresh tire tracks in the driveway, probably the regular security patrol. She had her student ID ready in her pocket, just in case. Growing up as a black girl in an affluent area had taught her to always be prepared for questioning. She was halfway across the property when something made her pause. Years of her mother's cautionary talks surfaced in her mind as she detected movement in the shadows. Maya's heart rate increased slightly, but she remained calm. She was exactly where she had a right to be. Reaching for her phone again, Maya decided to call her mother, not because she was scared, but because it was the smart thing to do. Mayor Johnson had drilled certain protocols into her daughter's head from an early age. Always let someone know where you are, always have ID ready, always stay calm but alert. The sound of footsteps behind her grew closer. Maya took a deep breath, remembering all the conversations she'd had with her mother about how to handle encounters with law enforcement. As the daughter of the city's first black female mayor, she had been prepared for moments like this her entire life. She turned slowly, her movements deliberate and calm, just as she had been taught. The setting sun was behind her now, and she could see a uniformed figure approaching with what appeared to be a drawn weapon. Maya's heart thundered in her chest, but her voice remained steady as she prepared to identify herself. In her pocket, her phone displayed an incoming call from her mother. Mayor Johnson had a sixth sense about these things. She always seemed to call at exactly the right moment. Maya's fingers moved toward her pocket, ready to reach for either her phone or her student ID. What happened next would be replayed on news channels across the country. The security cameras would capture every detail, every word, every movement. But in that moment, Maya Johnson was simply a teenage girl standing in a garden she had known all her life, about to become the center of a story that would change her city forever. The air was thick with tension as Officer Sullivan's voice cut through the evening quiet, and Maya's world teetered on the edge of a moment that would define not just her life, but an entire movement for change. The evening air crackled with tension as Officer Sullivan's voice rang out harsh and demanding across the garden. "Don't move, hands where I can see them." His weapon remained trained on Maya, his finger dangerously close to the trigger. Maya's heart pounded, but her mother's voice echoed in her mind. "Stay calm, speak clearly, make no sudden movements." She raised her hands slowly, keeping them visible as she had been taught. "Officer, I can explain. I'm Maya Johnson. I have permission to be here." "Shut up. Don't say another word." Sullivan barked, advancing closer. The security cameras captured his aggressive stance, the way he ignored standard police procedure for peaceful encounters. His body camera, which should have been activated, remained suspiciously off. Maya tried again, her voice steady despite her rising fear. "Sir, I have my ID in my pocket. Mrs. Henderson is my godmother. I can show you." I said don't move. Sullivan's voice carried years of unchecked prejudice. The simple sight of a young black girl in this wealthy neighborhood had triggered every bias he harbored. The setting sun cast long shadows across his face, distorting his features into a mask of authority and prejudice. In Maya's pocket, her phone continued to vibrate, her mother's incoming call now joined by texts from Emma, wondering where she was. The device felt heavy against her leg, a lifeline just inches away but impossibly distant under Sullivan's threatening gaze. "Officer, please," Maya spoke calmly, drawing on years of coaching from her mother about these exact situations. "I'm reaching for my phone very slowly to call my mom. She's the May." The next few seconds unfolded in slow motion. Maya's hand moved deliberately toward her pocket, her movements calm and telegraphed. But in Sullivan's mind, warped by years of unchallenged racial bias, he saw only what he expected to see, a threat where none existed. The security cameras caught every detail. Maya's careful movements, Sullivan's sudden aggressive step forward, the way his finger tightened on the trigger without warning or justification. The garden's peaceful evening atmosphere shattered with the sound of a gunshot. Maya felt the impact before she heard the shot. The force spun her around, her backpack falling to the ground, spilling its contents across the stone path. The Stanford acceptance letter fluttered in the evening breeze, specks of red staining its pristine white surface. She collapsed onto the garden path, her mother's carefully taught protocols meaningless now. The jasmine-scented air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder. Through the haze of shock and pain, Maya heard approaching sirens, the backup Sullivan had never waited for. Officer Thompson, responding to the earlier dispatch, arrived just seconds after the shot. He found Sullivan standing over Maya's fallen form, still holding his weapon, attempting to justify his actions. "She was reaching for something, I thought." Thompson's dash cam recorded his immediate response. "What have you done?" He rushed to Maya's side, radio already in hand. "Officer needs medical assistance at 1542 Maple Grove Road. Shooting victim, teenage female, officer involved. Rush response." The garden that had been Maya's childhood sanctuary became a crime scene in moments. Evidence markers dotted the ground where her belongings had scattered. Her phone lay face up on the path, displaying missed calls from her mother, Mayor Catherine Johnson, who was about to receive the call every parent fears most. Sullivan stood in shocked silence as more patrol cars arrived, their lights painting the darkening garden in alternating red and blue. The weight of what he had done began to sink in as he heard Thompson speaking into his radio. Victim identified as Maya Johnson. Yes, a mayor's daughter. The evening wind carried the sound of approaching helicopters, news crews already alerted to the shooting. In the distance, a crowd began to gather, word spreading quickly through the neighborhood. The first photos were already being uploaded to social media, showing Maya's unconscious form being loaded into an ambulance. What had started as a normal evening walk had escalated into a tragedy that would spark outrage across the nation. The security cameras had captured it all, irrefutable evidence of how quickly prejudice and power could combine with deadly consequences. As Maya fought for her life in the approaching ambulance, the city she called home teetered on the brink of an explosion that had been building for years. The match had been lit, and the flames of justice and reform were about to engulf them all. Mayor Catherine Johnson was in the middle of a city council meeting when her assistant burst through the doors, face ashen. The room fell silent as the whispered news reached her ears. Maya's been shot, by police, at the Henderson property. The mayor's composed exterior cracked for just a moment before years of public service training took over. She rose from her chair, her voice steady but tight with controlled emotion. "Meeting adjourned. Something urgent requires my immediate attention." Across town, the emergency room at Oakwood Memorial Hospital transformed into a fortress as police and press gathered outside. Inside, doctors worked frantically to save Maya's life. The bullet had missed her heart by inches, but internal bleeding threatened her survival with each passing minute. News helicopters circled overhead as crowds began forming outside the hospital. Social media exploded with videos from the Henderson security cameras, showing the unprovoked shooting in horrifying detail. Hashtags bearing Maya's name started trending nationwide within hours. In the hospital waiting room, Mayor Johnson sat rigid in her chair, still wearing her council meeting suit, her husband Thomas gripping her hand. Their phones buzzed constantly with messages from community leaders, civil rights activists, and national media outlets. but Catherine's eyes remained fixed on the emergency room doors, waiting for news about her daughter. Meanwhile, at the police station, Officer Sullivan sat in an interrogation room, his world unraveling. Internal affairs investigators reviewed the security footage repeatedly, their faces growing grimmer with each viewing. Sullivan's sergeant stood outside, fielding angry calls from the police chief and city officials. "What was going through your mind, Officer Sullivan?" The internal affairs investigator leaned forward, recording device between them. The footage shows she was clearly announcing her intentions. She was following proper protocol. Sullivan stared at his hands, his arrogance replaced by the dawning realization of what he had done. I assumed. His excuses sounded hollow even to his own ears. Back at the hospital, Dr. Sarah Chen emerged from the emergency room, her scrubs showing signs of the intense surgery. She approached the Johnsons, aware that her next words would impact not just this family, but the entire city. "Maya made it through surgery," Dr. Chen began, watching relief flood the parents' faces. "But she's not out of danger yet. The next 24 hours will be critical. The bullet caused significant internal damage." Outside the hospital, the crowd had grown to hundreds. People held candles and signs, their voices rising in both prayer and protest. The evening news showed split-screen coverage. Maya's school photo beside her academic achievements on one side, the security camera footage of the shooting on the other. At the Henderson property, now a closed crime scene, investigators cataloged evidence. They found Maya's scattered belongings, her student ID showing her bright smile, the blood-stained Stanford acceptance letter, her phone still displaying missed calls from her mother. Each item told the story of a bright future suddenly thrown into uncertainty. Social media erupted with posts from Maya's classmates and teachers. They shared stories of her leadership in student council, her volunteer work, her dreams of becoming a civil rights attorney like her grandfather. The hashtag Justice for Maya began trending worldwide. Mayor Johnson finally left her daughter's bedside long enough to make a brief statement to the press. She stood straight-backed in the hospital corridor, her voice carrying the weight of both personal anguish and public responsibility. "My daughter was shot today for the crime of walking home," she said, her words measured but powerful. "She was shot by an officer who saw her skin color before he saw her humanity. This ends now, not just for Maya, but for every child who deserves to walk home without fear." As night fell over the city, tensions continued to rise. Protest organizers planned marches, while police departments in neighboring cities prepared to send support. The police chief announced Sullivan's suspension and promised a full investigation, but the words felt insufficient against the backdrop of Maya's critical condition. In her hospital room, Maya lay unconscious, machines beeping steadily around her. Her mother sat beside her, still in her council meeting clothes, whispering the same words over and over. "Stay strong, baby girl. Stay strong. We're going to change things. You're going to help us change everything." The city held its breath, waiting to see if this would be the moment that finally forced real change, or just another tragedy lost to time and bureaucracy. But something felt different this time. The mayor's daughter had become the spark that would ignite a movement. 3 days after the shooting, Oakwood Memorial Hospital became the epicenter of a national story. News vans lined the streets, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like mechanical flowers. Inside Maya's ICU room, Mayor Catherine Johnson had barely left her daughter's side, sleeping in an uncomfortable hospital chair while managing the city's growing crisis from her phone. When Maya's eyes fluttered open, Catherine was there, gripping her hand. "Mom." Maya's voice was weak, barely a whisper. "I'm here, baby. You're safe now." Catherine fought back tears, pressing the call button for the nurse. Outside the hospital, the crowd had grown into thousands. People from all walks of life stood together, holding signs and sharing stories. Maya's classmates organized peaceful protests, wearing their student council pins and carrying copies of her Stanford acceptance letter, now a symbol of dreams interrupted by prejudice. At police headquarters, Chief Richardson faced a barrage of reporters. The security camera footage had gone viral, viewed millions of times across social media platforms. There was no way to spin this. The video showed clear misconduct. "Officer Sullivan has been terminated from the force," Richardson announced, his face grave. "We are cooperating fully with the district attorney's office for criminal charges. This is not who we are as a department." but evidence suggested otherwise. Investigative journalists uncovered Sullivan's long history of racial bias complaints, all buried in administrative files. Each revelation fueled more protests, more demands for systemic change. Maya's hospital room filled with flowers, cards, and stuffed animals from well-wishers across the country. Between visits from doctors and detectives taking her statement, she watched the news coverage on her tablet, seeing her story become a rallying cry for change. "Mom," Maya said during a quiet moment, her voice stronger now, "we have to make this mean something." Catherine looked at her daughter, her brave, beautiful girl who had done everything right and still ended up in a hospital bed. "It will, baby, I promise you that." The mayor's office released body camera footage from Officer Thompson, who arrived seconds after the shooting. The video showed Sullivan's immediate attempt to justify his actions, contrasting sharply with Thompson's horrified response and immediate call for medical help. National civil rights leaders arrived in the city, holding press conferences and meeting with local officials. Maya's story resonated because it shattered the myth that success, education, and status could protect against racial bias. In her hospital bed, Maya began physical therapy, fighting through pain to regain her strength. Her determination inspired thousands. Videos of her first steps down the hospital corridor went viral, showing her wearing a Stanford t-shirt sent by the university's Black Student Union. The district attorney announced criminal charges against Sullivan: attempted murder, aggravated assault, and civil rights violations. The former officer was arrested at his home, the same news helicopters that had covered the shooting now broadcasting his surrender. Mayor Johnson balanced her roles as mother and leader carefully. During press conferences, she spoke with the authority of her office and the passion of a parent whose child had been wronged. Her approval ratings soared as she introduced sweeping police reform legislation. "My daughter was shot for being black in what someone decided was the wrong neighborhood," she told the city council. "But that neighborhood was her home. Those gardens were where she played as a child. We cannot allow prejudice to decide who belongs where." Social media continued to amplify Maya's story. Teenagers across the country shared their own experiences with racial profiling using #WalkingWhileBlack. The Henderson family, watching events unfold from Europe, released a statement confirming Maya's lifelong permission to use their property as a shortcut. In Maya's hospital room, her friend Emma finally visited, crying as they hugged carefully around Maya's healing wounds. "Movie night feels stupid now," Emma whispered. "No," Maya replied, her voice firm despite her weakness. "Normal things matter. That's what they tried to take from me, the right to just be a normal teenager walking to a friend's house." As the sun set over the city that evening, Maya stood at her hospital window, watching the peaceful protesters below. Their candles created a river of light flowing through the streets. She pressed her hand against the cool glass, feeling the weight of everything that had changed. Her mother joined her at the window, putting an arm carefully around her shoulders. Together, they watched their city grapple with hard truths and the promise of change, knowing this was just the beginning of a much longer journey. 2 weeks after the shooting, Maya Johnson was released from the hospital. The media captured her exit. The mayor's daughter in a wheelchair, head held high, her Stanford t-shirt a deliberate statement of resilience. The crowd that had maintained a constant vigil outside the hospital erupted in cheers and raised fists. Back at City Hall, the machinery of justice and reform ground forward. Mayor Katherine Johnson presided over heated council meetings, her daughter's hospital bracelet still on her wrist. "This isn't just about my daughter anymore," Katherine declared during a particularly tense session. "It's about every child who deserves to walk home without fear. Every parent who shouldn't have to teach their kids how to survive a police encounter." Former Officer Sullivan's criminal trial preparation dominated local news. His defense team attempted to paint him as a dedicated officer who made a split-second mistake, but the security footage told a different story. Each time it played in court, the sound of the gunshot made Maya flinch. At home, Maya struggled with recovery, both physical and emotional. Nightmares plagued her sleep, the moment of the shooting playing on endless loop. But during her waking hours, she channeled her trauma into action, speaking to youth groups via video chat from her bed. "I did everything right," she told them, her voice steady despite the pain medication. "I followed every rule my mother taught me, and I still got shot. The system isn't broken. It was built this way. We need to rebuild it." The incident inspired a nationwide audit of police complaint records. Journalists uncovered similar patterns in departments across the country. Officers like Sullivan, with long histories of bias complaints, protected by a system designed to shield them from consequences. Maya's physical therapy sessions became symbolic broadcasts of determination. She shared her progress on social media, each painful step forward accompanied by messages about justice and perseverance. Her followers grew into the millions. Stanford University made a public statement, affirming Maya's acceptance and offering her a full scholarship. Ms. Johnson exemplifies the courage and leadership we value in our students, the dean announced. Her seat will be waiting when she's ready. The Henderson family returned from Europe to testify at Sullivan's trial. Mrs. Henderson, Maya's godmother, broke down on the stand as she described giving Maya permission to use the garden path since childhood. She was family, the elderly woman testified. She still is. In therapy sessions, Maya worked through her trauma with Dr. Martinez, a specialist in post-shooting recovery. "I'm angry," she admitted during one session, "not just about what happened to me, but about what keeps happening to others. How do I turn this anger into change?" The city itself seemed to be healing alongside Maya. Community meetings brought together police officers and residents for difficult but necessary conversations about bias and trust. Some officers resigned in protest of the new reforms. Others embraced the chance for meaningful change. Maya's first public appearance came at a youth leadership conference. She walked slowly to the podium, still tender from her injuries, but her voice rang clear through the auditorium. "They tried to write my story for me," she told the crowd, "but I'm holding the pen now." Late one evening, Mayor Johnson found Maya sitting in their garden, staring at the stars. "I miss walking," Maya said quietly. "Just walking without thinking about it, without being afraid." Catherine sat beside her daughter, careful of her healing wounds. "We'll get that back," she promised. "Not just for you, but for everyone." The security footage from that evening continued to circulate, now used in police training programs across the country as an example of how bias turns deadly. Each showing was accompanied by Maya's story, not just of the shooting, but of her achievements, her dreams, her humanity. As Maya's physical strength returned, so did her determination. She started planning her testimony for Sullivan's trial, working with prosecutors to ensure her story would help create lasting change. Her laptop filled with drafts of speeches, ideas for reforms, and plans for student activism at Stanford. The city watched its mayor's daughter transform from victim to voice of change, her generation's anger and hope flowing through her words. Maya Johnson was no longer just a girl who got shot. She was becoming a force for transformation, her very survival a testament to resilience and the power of truth. In her bedroom, Maya pinned a new calendar to the wall, marking the dates: physical therapy, trial preparation, Stanford orientation. Each day represented another step forward, another chance to turn pain into purpose, another opportunity to prove that change was not just possible, but inevitable. The courthouse buzzed with tension on the first day of James Sullivan's trial. Maya Johnson sat in the front row, her mother on one side and Emma on the other. Her Stanford acceptance let. District Attorney Sarah Chen laid out the prosecution's case with methodical precision. The security footage played on large screens, showing every devastating second. Maya squeezed her mother's hand as the gunshot echoed through the courtroom. "This isn't just about one shooting," Chen told the jury. "This is about the systematic failure that allowed an officer with 17 prior bias complaints to remain on duty until he nearly killed a teenage girl for walking home." Sullivan sat at the defense table, his police uniform replaced by a subdued suit. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of his actions. His eyes kept darting toward Maya, but she refused to look away. She wanted him to see her, alive, strong, and unafraid. The prosecution's witnesses painted a damning picture. Officer Thompson testified about arriving seconds after the shooting, describing Sullivan's immediate attempts to justify his actions. "There was no threat," Thompson stated firmly. "Just a young girl following all proper procedures." Mrs. Henderson's testimony brought many jurors to tears as she described Maya growing up in her garden. She had her first birthday party there, the elderly woman recalled. "We used to have tea parties under the jasmine vines." That garden was her sanctuary until this man turned it into a crime scene. Maya's testimony came on the fourth day. She walked to the witness stand without assistance, her head held high. For 2 hours, she described the shooting and its aftermath with remarkable composure. When asked about her recovery, she spoke about both physical and emotional scars. "I used to love walking at sunset," she told the courtroom. "Now I calculate risk with every step, but I refuse to let fear win. This has to mean something more than just my pain." Outside the courthouse, protesters maintained a peaceful vigil. Maya's classmates organized study groups on the courthouse steps, working on homework while holding signs demanding justice. The message was clear: life and learning continue, even in the face of injustice. Mayor Johnson's police reform bill gained momentum during the trial. Each revelation of departmental failure strengthened public support for change. The police union's opposition began to crumble as younger officers spoke out in favor of reform. "My daughter's story is tragic," Catherine told the city council, "but the real tragedy would be failing to use this moment to create lasting change. We have the chance to ensure no other parent gets that phone call." In the hospital, Dr. Chen testified about Maya's injuries, describing the complex surgery that saved her life. X-rays showed the bullet's path, mere centimeters from her heart. "It's a miracle she survived," Chen stated. "But she shouldn't have had to rely on miracles." Sullivan's defense crumbled under cross-examination. His claims of feeling threatened contradicted the clear video evidence. His history of biased policing emerged in stark detail. When he finally took the stand, his attempts to justify his actions fell flat against Maya's powerful testimony. After 2 weeks of testimony, the jury received their instructions. Maya sat through their deliberations working on her Stanford application essay. The topic seemed obvious now. Describe a moment that defined your purpose in life. The verdict came back in less than 6 hours. Guilty on all counts. As Sullivan was led away in handcuffs, Maya felt no joy, only a quiet sense of justice served. Her mother held her close as cameras flashed around them. That evening, the city council passed Maya's law with an overwhelming majority. The reforms included mandatory bias training, immediate suspension for racial complaints, and civilian oversight of police disciplinary procedures. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Maya celebrated by taking her first walk alone since the shooting. She chose the path through the Henderson's garden, now restored and blooming. Each step felt like reclaiming a piece of herself. Her phone buzzed with a message from Stanford's Black Student Union. They were naming their annual leadership summit in her honor. Another text followed from Emma, reminding her about their rescheduled movie night. Standing in the garden where everything had changed, Maya watched the sunset paint the sky. Her scars still ached sometimes, but they had become markers of survival rather than tragedy. She had learned that justice, like healing, comes in small steps forward. Mayor Johnson found her daughter there, looking thoughtful among the flowers. "Ready for what comes next?" she asked. Maya nodded, touching the acceptance letter in her pocket. "Ready to make it all mean something," she replied, turning toward home with purpose in her stride. 1 year after the shooting, Maya Johnson stood at the podium during Stanford University's freshman orientation. The auditorium was packed, students leaning forward to hear the story that had changed a nation. Her mother, Mayor Catherine Johnson, watched proudly from the front row. "My story could have ended in a garden on a summer evening," Maya began, her voice strong and clear. "Instead, it became a beginning. Not just for me, but for thousands of others who deserve better from those sworn to protect them." The changes in her hometown had been dramatic. Maya's law had become a model for police reform across the country. James Sullivan's sentencing had made national headlines. 20 years for attempted murder and civil rights violations. But Maya hadn't attended the hearing. She was too busy helping her mother establish the Johnson Foundation for Justice Reform, which provided scholarships to young activists and support for families affected by police violence. In her Stanford dorm room, Maya had created a wall of memories. Newspaper clippings, letters from supporters, and photos of protest marches. But pride of place went to a picture of her first steps during physical therapy, beneath which she'd written, "Every step forward matters." The freshman class included several students who had been inspired by her story to pursue careers in civil rights law and public policy. Emma had joined her at Stanford, their friendship stronger than ever. Together, they led campus discussions about racial justice and community healing. The bullet that was meant to silence me gave me a voice instead, Maya told her fellow students. But more importantly, it taught me that change doesn't come from tragedy alone. It comes from what we choose to do afterward. Mayor Johnson's reforms had transformed their city's police department. New officers underwent extensive community integration training. Veteran officers who embraced the changes became mentors for rookie cops. Complaint rates had dropped dramatically, while community trust grew stronger. The Henderson Garden, where everything had changed, bloomed more beautifully than ever. Mrs. Henderson had donated the property to Maya's foundation, turning it into a space for community dialogue and reconciliation. Police officers and local teenagers now met there regularly, learning to see each other as human beings rather than threats. Maya's physical scars had faded, though they still told their story. The emotional healing had been harder, but she had learned to use her experience to help others. Her trauma counseling group for young survivors of violence had chapters opening across the country. On campus, Maya excelled in her pre-law studies, her experiences shaping her understanding of justice and reform. Her professors noted her unique ability to bridge theory and reality, to turn legal concepts into practical solutions for community healing. The hardest lesson, she told her orientation audience, was learning that justice isn't just about punishment. It's about changing the systems that make injustice possible. It's about creating new paths forward. Back in her hometown, the Police Academy's training program now included a mandatory session called the Maya Johnson Case Study. Officer Thompson, who had been promoted to training supervisor, used the security footage to teach new recruits about bias, procedure, and the sacred trust between police and community. Maya's mother had won re-election by a landslide, her commitment to reform resonating with voters across all demographics. The Johnson Foundation had become a powerful force for change, supporting initiatives that brought communities and law enforcement together in meaningful dialogue. As Maya concluded her orientation speech, she shared her vision for the future. We can't change what happened that day in the garden, but we can change what happens next. Every one of us has the power to turn pain into purpose, tragedy into transformation. The standing ovation lasted several minutes. Among the crowd, Maya spotted faces from every background, united in their commitment to change. Her own journey from victim to advocate had shown them that progress was possible, even in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. Later that evening, Maya walked across campus alone, enjoying the simple pleasure of moving freely through the world. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. Another city had adopted Maya's law, another step forward in the long journey toward justice. Looking up at the stars, Maya smiled. The garden where she was shot had taught her that growth can come from the darkest moments. Now, as she began her college journey, she carried that lesson forward. Hope, like justice, blooms most beautifully in places where it's needed most. The next chapter was beginning, and Maya Johnson was ready to write it.